Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris Guest, and for those who don't know me, my day job is the Managing Director of LS Plant Breeding, and I have the great privilege to be the Chair of AIC, the Agricultural Industries Confederation. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the AIC Conference 2023, working with Natural Captial within the agri-food supply chain. And it would seem to me that in the current climate, the subject has never been more appropriate. We live in a time of many challenges, both in business, societal and personal, but there are also opportunities and societal needs. The geopolitical challenges in the world have a global impact on all of us, and the pressure on food production and land use are in constant flux. All this is why we need to secure a resilient and sustainable food supply, one of the key aims of the AIC. We should also aspire to make the UK a better place for investment in food production to feed not only our own nation, but nations around the world. This can only be delivered in a regulatory framework that ensures opportunities are not missed and sustainability remains a core focus. Realising such aspirations would provide us with a leading proposition on global trade. This matters because business invests when they see a clear plan and have confidence. This encourages further investment, which in turn will help to remedy the productivity challenges we face today. Recent legislation for gene editing or precision breeding techniques is a great example of the positive steps taken by government when it engages constructively with industry to grasp opportunities for a common benefit. For those who joined us, I hope you all enjoyed the AIC dinner last night. I certainly did. Once again, I would like to thank the Right Honourable George Eustace MP for his reflections last night. It was great to hear his thoughts. This formal dinner was to mark 20 years of AIC, and hopefully you will have seen the 20th anniversary brochures on the tables, which look back on some of the many successes of our trade association since it was formed in 2003. The creation of AIC was a bold yet fortuitous move to unite three separate agri-supply trade bodies into one strong and coherent voice for our industry. I think it's clear that this has paid enormous dividends, not just for the agri-supply, but the wider agri-food industries of the UK. Our lobbying influence and professional services continue to go from strength to strength as we strive to support modern, sustainable and commercial agriculture. It's great to see the room packed with our members, stakeholders, government officials, media and guests, including a number of students from universities. There are also a number of our delegates here as part of the Next Generation initiative, something very close to my heart. This recognises the importance of succession planning within our industry. It's so important that we attract fresh talent and enable those people to develop. Welcome to you all. I know you will all find today valuable in developing your knowledge base and prospects in your chosen career. Once again, the AIC team has pulled together an impressive array of speakers to tackle the challenges of managing natural capital, and I look forward to a thought-provoking and inspiring day. Speakers have joined us from many parts of the world, and we thank them for supporting the AIC. The need for strong, united representation from AIC has never been more crucial to make sure that the clear, constructive messages are being heard by government and acted upon. I urge all of you, members and stakeholders, to collaborate during these turbulent times. Finally, I must say a big thank you to our sponsors and partners whose input is vital and part of running a hugely successful event of this scale. Time for me now to hand over to our conference chair, the BBC radio and TV presenter Charlotte Smith. Charlotte will be well known by many of you and is an experienced broadcaster and conference host. She presents Farming Today, among other programmes on BBC Radio 4, and also Countryfile on TV. A great career which all began with a conversation in a lift and led to her crafting a specialism in rural affairs. So thank you for your support by chairing today's event. I'll now hand over to Charlotte to chair the AIC Conference 2023, and I look forward to the debate on working with natural capital within the agri-food supply chain. Charlotte.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am the living embodiment of being careful what you agree to in a lift. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the sharp-eyed will notice that I hold the clipboard of self-importance. This means that I am in charge, which is probably news to Robert, but it's true. First, we're going to do the housekeeping, and then I'm going to tell you the rules. So please pay attention. Okay, a bit of housekeeping. In the event of a fire, please use the exits shown at the back and follow the signs to the nearest fire assembly point. And just to note, there are no plans for any tests, so if you hear an alarm, it's the real thing. This conference is being recorded, just to make you aware. Can I also remind you now, if you haven't done already, to please download the Slido app, either onto your laptop or onto your phone. This will enable you to vote in the polls and also to ask a question. Once you get onto Slido, just look for the hashtag AIC Conference 23, AIC Conference 23, and you'll be able to find it. As delightfully, we are all here in the same room. If you want to ask a question in one of the many Q&A sessions later on, you can just stick your hand in the air and wave it around. Please, though, do wait until one of the roving microphones makes its way to you, because we won't be able to hear you without the microphone. And please, however you are asking a question, could you keep it short and to the point? That will make everybody very happy, thank you. As you will have noticed, we have a very full programme today. I can't be the only person who glanced at it and thought, oh crikey, is it a two-day conference and I've got it all terribly wrong. Now, it's split broadly into three areas: the market and economic outlook, political priorities, and market commentary. And we'll have various perspectives on all those three major topics. As you will hopefully be aware, today's working title is Working with Natural Capital Within the Agri-Food Supply Chain. Now, there are various definitions of natural capital, but the one we're kind of going with is natural capital is the world's stock of natural resources, including geology, soils, air, water, and all living organisms. All of these underpin our economy and society and thus make human life possible. So we look forward to today, but ladies and gentlemen, we cannot do it without you. This is not one of those conferences where you can have a little doze. I'm so sorry. You're going to have to wake up and take part. We really do want to hear your short, brief, to the point questions and comments as we go through the day. There are lots of different AIC members here from lots of different sectors, as well as a range of non-members and stakeholders. So if we all work together, we should, by the end of today, come away with some key takeaways from the conference. Just a quick organisational note. If you're a student or a next generation ticket holder, could you all come up to the stage at the first coffee break so we can take a lovely picture of you? So without further ado, let's test our technology and move on to the first Slido poll. So phones or laptops at the ready. Here is the question. Does the industry believe that the agri-supply sector is in a strong position to work with natural capital in the agri-supply chain in the coming years? So, oh, there we go. So strongly disagree is 1 and strongly agree is 5. Now, while you're voting, let me also mention that this event is a BASIS registered event, the details of which are on the slide and can be found on the agribusiness website. So I'll just leave you for that for a minute because there's quite a lot of information on it. Right, if we get back to our Slido, let's see how we're doing. Has everyone voted? Is anyone still struggling? If anyone's having any problems with Slido, wave your hand in the air and we'll try and sort it out. When I say we, I don't mean me. I mean somebody who understands it. Right, let's see where we've got to on this Slido. Does the industry believe that the agri-supply sector is in a strong position to manage natural capital in the agri-supply chain in the coming years? Well, the winner is mildly disagree on 23%, neutral 14%, strongly disagree 10%, strongly agree 8%. So let's see if that... Oh, there you go. Mildly disagree is moving. Mildly agree. Where's mildly agree? Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't even see that. Well, why isn't it coloured differently? Is that me? I didn't even see that. Thank you very much, gentlemen. So actually, that's a lot more optimistic. Mildly agree, 39. It's gone down since I criticised it, look. Mildly disagree, 25. Oh, 26. Okay, make your mind up. Right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. There will be more of those polls throughout the day, and I'll try to work out how to read the results. In the meantime, could Rob and Ed join me up here on the stage, please? We are going to first hear from Robert Shearsby, as you will all know, the AIC's Chief Executive, who's going to outline the key priorities.
All right, good morning, everybody, and Charlotte, thank you for that warm introduction. It'll be interesting to see how those polls move around as we go through the day. So, welcome to our guests and members to the 2023 AIC Conference, the AIC's 20th anniversary year. I'm Robert Shearsby, AIC Chief Executive. I and AIC colleagues are here because of the presence of mind of a group of people 20 years ago. Their vision to establish the AIC to create a single voice for the agri-supply industry across the United Kingdom was true leadership. It is my privilege to lead the AIC, working with a skilled staff team based in Peterborough, where today we are proud to represent more than 200 businesses across our 5 sectors. Having recently surveyed member businesses, we can today reveal that their cumulative value to the UK economy represents in excess of £17 billion, that part of the £127 billion UK agri-food sector. The AIC 20 years ago had different challenges in agriculture and the agri-supply sector. Back in 2003, we were in the aftermath of foot and mouth disease, the relatively new formation of a government department of DEFRA, and fundamental policy changes to the Common Agricultural Policy. Today, 20 years later, we find we're a country trading free of the rules of the European Union following the UK referendum vote in 2016. When it comes to policy, we're seeing it evolve across agriculture and the environment, developing at differing speeds and separately in England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. At a UK level, we continue to navigate our way through the challenges of international trade agreements alongside growing commercial interest in sustainability, as we all continue to work towards the statutory deadlines for being net zero by 2050 and 2045, whilst keeping our eye on legislative divergence and what that means for trade. A challenge at a UK as well as European and international level. In addition to these challenges, we find a world more driven by dispute, be that war or political difference, or even regulatory divergence. This past year has seen the AIC attend the Prime Minister's Summit on Farm to Fork at number 10 Downing Street, where I was able to remind the Prime Minister that food and feed in this country starts before the farm gate, with the work of AIC members ensuring that farmers have access to the inputs they need. It's welcome that the Prime Minister, encouraged by NFU President Minette Batters, held the summit to raise awareness across Cabinet on agri-food issues, something we all hope Minister Mark Spencer, alongside ministerial and Cabinet colleagues, will be able to continue to build on. Thinking of the here and now, it's concerning that we find ourselves in a place where the understanding of how assurance underpins the UK food and feed supply chain seems to be under scrutiny and is perhaps misunderstood, or its value underappreciated. We believe in keeping supply chains as straightforward as possible. We need unifying assurance schemes that are fit for purpose, meet legal requirements, and are appropriate for supply chain needs. Our own agri-supply assurance schemes of TASC, FEMAS, UFAS, and FIAS, and on top of that, the professional registers of BASIS, FACTS, and the Feed Advisor Register stand testament to the rigour and professionalism of our own part of the supply chain. including the value of earned recognition with enforcement agencies. These schemes help provide confidence to the whole supply chain. It seems to me that a world without single unifying assurance schemes will lead to a world where multiple inspections and audits would be required across the whole supply chain, introducing cost and administrative burden to meet multiple audit requirements. Other areas, the digital passport for combinable crops, is something that a year ago the AIC was at and remains at the heart of those discussions. Listening to our members this time last year and identifying there was a long list of questions that seemed unanswered, AIC asked that the development of the passport be paused to enable these questions to be answered and a business case prepared that all those in the supply chain could look at. Much of this year, and I'm pleased that not only my time, but also the time of Jonathan Lane of the Arable Marketing Committee, we've spent many Friday mornings engaging across industry to ensure that the development of the business case is done in a professional and robust way that will stand scrutiny. We've worked with facilitated groups, with AIC members and others attending. We've looked at developing aspects of that business case. Next week, the business case developed by the industry groups with input from across the agri-food sector, including the AIC's Digital Grain Passport member and scheme participant working group, will be made available for all to review. AIC, through meetings and events, will be encouraging our members to share their views on whether the business case meets the industry requirements and AIC tests during this consultation period. Thinking about sustainability, over the past 2 decades, sustainability has seen a significant change in prominence. I'm delighted that AIC Head of Sustainability, Vicky Robinson, who joined the team this summer, is here today guiding AIC members through this area of unquestionable importance. Today, supply chain customers are much more focused on this policy area, as indeed are many sections of wider society and capital markets. Over the coming months, the AIC will be updating the first version of the sustainability roadmap to ensure it meets the needs of your business, as well as enabling us to set out to government the progress we as a sector are making towards net zero. And I'd encourage fellow stakeholder representatives from across industry to look at our roadmap and to look at its successor and see how you can contribute your part to that route to net zero. Which is why earlier this summer, following member requests, the AIC Sustainability Liaison Group, with the support of the AIC Board, introduced the Sustainability Self-Assessment Framework. Using this valuable tool, businesses can benchmark themselves as well as enable the AIC to present to government the progress we are making as an industry towards the and assess the challenges we face in achieving net zero, for which we may need support or time to plan for. Please visit the AIC website to find out more about our work on sustainability, our self-assessment framework tool, and its value to your business. On sustainability, we clearly have a legislative deadline, and we must ensure government are aware of where the challenges lie, and even where support or innovation might be required as we move towards 2050. Our own revised roadmap will help set out where we think the next chapter of this journey will take us and what we will require. It's well known that for most of this century, UK agricultural productivity has had a somewhat stunted trajectory. Yet other countries are performing better than us. Governments across the UK, through various initiatives, are looking to support productivity. We believe there is more that we can do in this area, and that the opportunities to develop will require a change in thinking, which AIC member businesses, through their advisor teams, are extremely well placed to support. So if we are to deliver on the combined demands required of land, then it is reasonable that we should have a land use strategy. The demands on this scarce yet critical resource should be thought about strategically, rather than what currently feels like an ad hoc manner. Policy development can be a barrier to confidence or an enabler. It's clear that the current uncertainty is leading to businesses withholding investment decisions. It should be of concern to our government that this uncertainty is holding back gains in UK productivity. It is not too late for our country to establish a policy framework which will encourage confidence to invest in the UK. The longer we leave it, though, the greater the gap will develop and the harder it will be for us to catch up. This leads me to food security. The past 2 years have clearly shown that our nation's food security is more fragile than we thought. From fresh produce availability to labour shortages, global supply chains have been stretched to, and at times beyond, breaking point. The responsibility of a state is to keep its people safe and to keep them fed. This is why policies that support food security should be brought to the fore. In closing, this coming year will almost certainly bring a general election, which is why this autumn the AIC attended political party conferences to gauge where the momentum lies. We are now finalising the priorities that we will impress upon those main political parties in the run-up to the general election, with many of the issues I've already alluded to. To further inform this process and to provide insight into the future direction of our sector during these transitional times, and as part of our 20th anniversary celebrations, AIC commissioned Dr. Marcus Bellet-Travers of Anglia Ruskin University to produce an independent report that considers the many complex issues faced and the opportunities for food production in the UK. The key finding of this report is the need for an independent food security committee. A committee which can ensure that people of this country are kept safe with food availability maintained, and the wider global context that means. In a moment, our Head of Policy and External Affairs, Ed Barker, who's been the driving force behind this commission, will present more details and outline this core conclusion, which we feel is so relevant to where we find ourselves. I've been reassured to see that others in the industry have also recently touched on the pressing need for a much wider collaborative effort on food security, and would ask all policymakers to look closely at our report. On that note, it's my great pleasure to introduce the AIC's Head of Policy and External Affairs, Ed Barker. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning, everyone. I'll just say a few quick words about our report. Here it is, Powering Up Productivity for Sustainable Food Security. Don't worry, other copies will be available. You don't have to fight over this one. And this was to mark the AIC's 20th anniversary. Instead of a reflection, we felt we wanted to look forwards at the next 20 years of UK agriculture. Although we're a UK-based association, Peterborough has been our home for the last 20 years, and it felt very appropriate to commission Anglia Ruskin University, a local academic institution, to partner with. We were really impressed with their new campus in Peterborough, and their recent merger with Whittle College underlines their credentials to both research and practice of agriculture in the United Kingdom. It was important that it was a totally independent report, separate from the AIC, providing critical challenge from the outside, which is what it does. As Robert has outlined, we have the backdrop of a very volatile world. Climate change, COVID, Ukraine, regulatory interventions mean that we need to understand our yield gap. What are we in the UK not producing that we could be sustainably? We know that agricultural businesses need medium to long-term certainty and a clear capacity to invest. There is a global race for developing the sustainable food solutions of tomorrow. We can't sit still, and it's easy to be left behind if businesses are not confident in the UK as a serious producer of food. We cannot overlook as well that we have changing populations, diets, trade balances, and how these can combine to amplify the impacts of global trade volatility. The Powering Productivity report poses, where can we make the productivity gains having established the yield gaps? It shows that there is no single method and that productivity in the landscape is very complicated indeed. How many times recently have you come across reports or announcements that have claimed that there is a silver single bullet to answer UK farming productivity? It's a trap that many, I think, fall into. In the last year, I've read reports that have focused on a number of single issues, very important, but their potential beneficial impact to UK agriculture. Feed additives, advice, labour, genetics, pulses, artificial intelligence, dietary change, automation, and broader, less defined concepts like regenerative agriculture, nature-based solutions, quality over quantity, all in reports I've read over the last year, but all focusing on the single issue. This report reflects and recognises all of those, stressing that productivity is multifaceted and complex, with many different variables that have a different impact in different parts of the UK farming sector. Many are interdependent, and we need to recognise that. Attracting staff cannot be achieved if there are insufficient training or educational pathways. Improving diversity of crops cannot be achieved if there are no markets for them, or if the chemistry or the seed is simply not available. Improving livestock health and lowering emissions can't be achieved if we don't have a planning system to help accommodate new infrastructure and buildings, for example. We can't export goods if we have barriers to trade which are erected with our most important markets. So this is embracing the complexity of productivity and appreciates the number of moving parts, big and small, that are required. That's why we used our engine analogy. Hopefully that'll work. Right. This report not only approaches our yield gap, but it then takes a step further by asking, so what? Understanding our theoretical yield gap means nothing if it's not acted upon. It's become clear that UK businesses, farmers and land managers need that long-term clarity. Short-term, reactive, unpredictable decision-making is not only bad for our businesses, but it challenges our food security. As of this week, we are now on our 8th Secretary of State in DEFRA in 9 years. In that time, USA, Germany, Canada are on their 3rd. It clearly is a huge challenge, and I know, and I pay tribute to the DEFRA civil servants in the room who are no doubt having to manage that approach for the last decade. But this goes beyond just political continuity. The incapacity to plan, build, and invest affects our food security at a time we need it more than ever. As Robert mentioned, the report calls, therefore, for an independent UK Food Security Committee. Similar to the Climate Change Committee, we need a cross-government, cross-industry, cross-UK forum to plan for the future of our food supply. As the report finds, agricultural production and the balance of trade is a cross-policy issue. For too long, DEFRA has been expected to carry a role that should be a priority for all of government. That is why it needs not only DEFRA, but transport, education, trade, business, climate change, the entire union of the UK, and of course the Treasury, to be an active part of the long-term planning process. Independence is key, and that's why it needs to be taken outside of the scope of short-term political priorities. In many ways, our political system is poorly designed for such long-term planning. Instead, we need independent advocates without short-term political pressures to plan for our production of food in the long term. And this appears to be in the zeitgeist. This concept is one that's been alluded to by other organisations and parliamentarians. I think it goes to show there is a genuine interest across relevant agricultural and business stakeholders to work together in the long term. The challenge is therefore laid now to political parties and UK administrations if they can do the same thing. We hope the report at least stimulates that thinking and a combination of academic research into our yield gaps, but also a thought leadership piece as to how to practically plan for the long term. I would really pose to anyone here how we can embrace the complexity of production and not fall into oversimplification. To conclude, land is a finite resource, as are the increasing pressures upon it. We have to get away from food security as a short-term political combative issue. The report was commissioned to mark the 20th anniversary of the AIC, and in doing it, ARU, AIC, and our member businesses are firmly thinking about the next 20. The copies of the report will be available in the coffee break, so please do pick one up. And with that, I thank you very much.
Just making sure Ed doesn't make for the door, if you'd like to come and join me here. Any questions, ladies and gentlemen, either hit the Slido or stick your hand in the air and start waving it around. And we'll just have a quick chat with these two about this report. While you are thinking, if you're going to wave your hand, by the way, make it really obvious, you know, as if you're drowning or something, because I'm really good at missing people. Right, and don't speak until I tell you to, and when a roving microphone has come. Okay, you are not alone in calling for some sort of strategy or commission on food security, the Crop Protection Association, the Soil Association, among others. What would you hope that it would actually achieve?
Challenge, rigour and challenge. Looking at this as a political issue, I don't think helps anyone. Trying to use it as a way of fighting your political opponents really assists no one. When we look historically at long-term infrastructure planning, it was done on a cross-party approach across the UK. And really, if we can sit down and define our long-term plans as a cross-party, UK-wide approach, then at least that's a good start for businesses in the room to know, what does the UK want? What is the big plan? Because for the last decade, we've only been thinking about until the next year, probably.
Talking of definitions, Anonymous on Slido asks, can you define UK food security? Does it involve UK production and sustainability?
I think, Charlotte, a really exciting point is that by inviting Anglia Ruskin University to write this independent report, it's a leap of faith, I can tell you that much, that you commission it, and then you sit back and wait and see. It's been really exciting working with Anglia Ruskin University, seeing how the report's developed, their thinking, their interviews and everything else. So the question's gone off the screen now, hasn't it? But can we define it? I think it can be defined, but that's what an independent committee, Ed set out the roundel up there of the stakeholders that should be involved. It needs everybody. It can't be done in isolation. It's too important strategically to this country for it to become a political football. And a strategy is great, but actually we're coming up with an idea here through the report with Anglia Ruskin that enables government to say, actually, we take food security as a country seriously, the strategic investment, the inward investment that could deliver to the UK, the confidence to farmers, the confidence, therefore, to the agri-supply industry to invest for the future. You could start to change how UK agriculture works, and that's the quite exciting thing.
We have to be careful as well not to conflate food security with self-sufficiency, which does happen sometimes. We often think, right, we must become self-sufficient, and I think we have to understand and recognise that consumers, whatever they choose to do, will want to consume imported goods, and we need to export goods as well. Look at the livestock sectors, we need to have carcass balance, but also in the cereals sector as well with exportable surpluses in certain years. So that's true of our inputs as well. So I think we have to be very clear on that, but having the balance of your domestic supply of goods is a core part of it. Inflation, part of the reason why inflation was driven so much this year was because of a reliance on imported goods, and nowhere did I see in government that was considered until we were reacting to it.
Two quick questions from Slido. Firstly, was there anything that particularly surprised you with the findings of the report?
One thing that Marcus was quite keen to highlight, particularly looking back over a lot of the modelling, was one way in which we could try and approach food security was actually, instead of focusing purely on productivity, was simply trying to look at more predictable output. We often look at having to focus on productivity as an end in itself, but given the volatility, particularly in external factors, can we try and look at a way in which yield output is actually more predictable? And that was an interesting challenge as opposed to simply looking at enhancing productivity for its own sake.
Question from Andrew Meredith of Farmers Weekly. Do you think the loss of BPS will improve productivity?
Great question, Andrew. I think it could do, because it means that you are no longer tied to production. You are free as farmers to make the business decision you want to make. But that's quite a different place to where we've been for the last generation, the last 40 odd years, one way or another. So how it will play out and what the economic consequences are, no crystal balls here yet, Charlotte, on that.
I'm going to stop you from answering because we're getting a move on very quickly. What timescale do you see this independent committee being formed? What are the next steps to keep the momentum following the publication of the report?
Every political party, probably from here on until the next election, will have us in their ear mentioning this every time we speak to them. It would be great if we can get commitments in next manifestos to try and look towards establishing that. Look, these things, anyone who knows anything about political processes or legislation knows these things don't move quickly, but we have to start somewhere, and whether or not we use existing legislation to tie that in, or even have new legislation to try and enshrine this, much like the Climate Change Committee is, we really have to begin now, because if we sit and wait and prevaricate for another year, then it's another year lost. But I'd love to see it put in, when, whoever's in government next, to see that really started out, and at least we can have that in law, and we've got at least a platform to start to put it together.
Great. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Obviously, Robert and Ed will be around all day. Grab them in coffee breaks and at lunchtime if you want to talk more about this. But for now, thank you both very much. Now we're going to move on to the market and economic outlook section of our day. And to be honest, I'm not sure that our next speaker really needs any introduction at all. Minette Batters, NFU President and farmer. There you go, I've sneaked in an introduction anyway. She's going to talk about natural capital from a farming perspective. Minette.
Charlotte, thank you very much indeed, and very good morning, everyone. It's fantastic to be here. I can't remember how long ago it was last year. It was probably about 2 years ago. Feels like a lot has happened in the last 2 years, and Ed was talking about the number of Secretaries of State. I met my 6th Secretary of State in 6 years yesterday when I was lucky enough to have a meeting with Steve Barclay, newly in, and it really has been quite an extraordinary time. And if I can diverge a little bit, Charlotte, I wanted to very much talk about working capital as well as natural capital and the politics to a certain extent that sits behind all of this, because not only have I worked with 6 different Secretaries of State, I've worked with 3 different Prime Ministers in the last 12 months. And indeed, the one that I started off with back in 2014 is now back in the Foreign Office. And who saw that one coming? I certainly didn't see that one coming, and apparently George Eustace didn't either. So it shows clearly, and probably shows to George, that your political career is never over. So look, you have to have, and Tim Morden is standing in for the Minister, you've got to have huge sympathy for officials in this fast-changing landscape, effectively, because those 3 Prime Ministers that I have worked with could not have been more different. And there is legacy from all of them. The world that we were in when we started this journey, public monies for public goods, a green Brexit, the world has changed completely since that time. So a global pandemic, a war in Ukraine, and we have to respond to that, and we have to be agile to all of that. And I'm really conscious in the final rolls of the dice, effectively, of my time at the NFU. I stand down at the end of February. In those 10 years, how much has changed, and the role of the NFU. We were founded in 1908, interestingly replacing the Lincolnshire Farmers Union, and of course our first president was Colin Campbell. And if you go back to that time, the role of the NFU was brought about, and I think this has stood true for every single president of the NFU. It was to rebuild credibility and integrity with the government of the day, and to build relationships and collaborate. And that is going to be a strong theme of what I want to say to you today. Because working together, collaborating, working in partnership as a supply chain with government is the only road to success. It hasn't always felt like that. For me personally, it's felt very challenging at times, but ultimately that is the place that we've got to get to. If I look at the macroeconomic outlook right now, it remains really, really tough. We've got half the country underwater. We've got a potato harvest that has not been harvested in many places. We've got a lot of sugar beet still to harvest. We've got a lot of planting that has disappeared completely, and we've got a lot of planting that hasn't happened. And it's fair to say the winter months, no matter what happens, they always look tough. Always, always. And we get to March, and actually then everything looks better again, and off we go. But the winter is hard yards. But this feels harder yards than ever before, really, because if I look at where we are on the BPS journey, interesting comments, Rob, on productivity. Does losing BPS, does it benefit productivity? I think my nervousness as we cap BPS is that it has acted as the only comfort blanket to deal with volatility and risk. And when you've got half the country underwater, if you have disease outbreaks, whatever happens, it has been there to deal with those problems. And there are really no countries in the world that do not have something in place if they are serious food producers to deal with volatility and risk. And I would say this has been the hardest message to land with government. There is not going to be a farm bill size insurance pot of money. It's not going to be there. So what is going to replace it? I've been amazed really at the political embracement and abandonment of whether food production matters or not. And this is repeated throughout history, effectively. 1947, the last Agricultural Act, 30% self-sufficient, rationing, 2 world wars, decision taken then by the Attlee government that this could never happen again. And we went from 30% self-sufficiency then to 80% plus in the 1980s. And we're at a real point, I think, of decision-making now as to what that is going to look like and whether action is going to be taken. It'd be really interesting to listen to Charles Godfrey and hear Charles's thoughts. I've personally been amazed that had we continued to build on the last financial crisis, the work of John Beddington, and effectively the perfect storm that he predicted. John must be feeling very proud of himself right now, because the perfect storm he predicted in 2030 is happening now. You know, geopolitical tensions, water security, weather events, climate change colliding, and the perfect storm of 2030. It's actually the perfect storm of 2023, but it's not going to change. These input costs that we're looking at on the back of the war in Ukraine, unrest in the Middle East, nothing is going to change. We're going to be riding out this volatility storm for a long while to come, and maybe it is just the new normal. Had we built on those building blocks then, I'm only talking about 2011, it's not very long ago, had we continued to build on that work then and the work of David Bolcombe, the Royal Society, remember the words, a lot of people didn't understand it necessarily at the time, sustainable intensification. What that was all about, that was about producing more food on less land with less inputs. Actually, the journey to carbon neutral food production. We would be so much better if we'd stayed working from that point in time. But we didn't. Political decisions get made, different governments, and you've seen, and the point I make is even within the Conservative Party, you've seen totally different approaches. We have beaver enclosures that are full to bursting. We have species reintroduction committees. We have an animal sentience committee. All of those things, worthy and suitable, maybe, but they are not really of this time, which is why the beaver enclosure doors remain shut. And hopefully they will do for a little bit longer until we establish a proper working management plan. But back to, I guess, working together. And more that unites us than divides us. And I look at what we have achieved as an industry by working together. I've given a lot of evidence with Ed Barker, been giving evidence with Rob Sheasby often as well. And I think most recently, what we've achieved, and I'm delighted to see Rachel Irving in the room, who heads up pesticides in DEFRA, seed treatments for maize planting has gone to the wire. Really, really concerning how far that went to actually not having the ability to get those seed treatments in place. Really welcome news recently that the HSE has signed off the emergency use authorisations, that DEFRA has laid that legislation, and that gives the industry security until the 1st of July 2027. We called for that meeting in the beginning of July, and I was delighted that the Farming Minister accepted it. But had we not been able to work collectively as one industry, we would not have had the power to go to government and say, look, this has to happen. And it's very easy to think that this is completely normal. This period that we are working in is completely normal. It is not normal. We are setting primary legislation. Primary legislation, this is sort of every 100-year type of stuff. This is groundbreaking, and we have to get it right, which means that working together emphasis. And don't forget, in all of this, I can see many Welsh colleagues, we've got the Scottish Minister talking, we are not one country, we are four, and we have to be really mindful in all of that with this decision making. I look at what we did as an industry with Option 4, and thanks to Red Tractor colleagues who I know are in the room today for working with us. I mean, this on urea, it will save the industry 125 million over the next 8 years. So being able to keep uninhibited urea on the marketplace allows us to be globally competitive, and it allows the market to work better. Those are just two small examples, I think, of what we've done. I can't stand here today and not just briefly touch on assurance and what we believe needs to happen. We are asking for an independent review on governance. It's interesting for me that there are other assurance bodies out there, RSPCA, Soil Association, LeafMark, technical bodies doing a technical job. Is the governance right of Red Tractor? You've got a lot of vested interests round the table. Is that the best way of working? If I look at the BEIC, you have packers and you have producers sat at the table. You don't have the BRC there. So it's right. Over 20 years on, it is right to look at it. It is right to say, in post-Brexit Britain, can we turbocharge it from farm to fork? Can we do it differently? Do those that are furthest away from the market, do they need to do everything that those that are closest to the market do? One thing is for certain, that I am absolutely sure of, is we have to be able to differentiate in this marketplace. We have the most prized food market in the world, which is why everybody wants access to it, whether it's the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Canadians, everybody wants access to our market. Even the Indians now determined to get a whole economy deal and get agriculture in there. So we have to be able to differentiate, because we have laws that keep our levels of production and regulations that keep our levels of production up here, and indeed, in many cases, have been raised. So those will be two independent reviews. They will only be successful if the whole chain buys into them. You know, can we, if we take oilseed rape as an example, can we at scale be able to differentiate Red Tractor oilseed rape with imported? Can we? We've got to ask the question. We've got to try. We've got to try and do things differently, and we've got to be fit for purpose on the world stage as an independent outside of the European Union. I just want to finish off with some thoughts on effectively the politics, because influencing prime ministers has been incredibly important. And this particular prime minister has made some really important commitments. Now, you know, Rob touched on, you know, the differences between food security, self-sufficiency. Ultimately, this prime minister committed on the campaign trail back in 2022 that he would set a new self-sufficiency target, and he would change the reporting from 3 yearly to annual. Now, that has to be the first step that happens. You cannot get, and applaud the work that has been done with the independent report by the AIC, you cannot get anywhere until you establish that one point. Now, that really matters, because right now, local governments, local authorities are working up plans. They have house building targets, they have green energy targets, they have nature targets, they have clean air targets, they have clean water targets, they have net zero targets. They have no targets on food production. So if you're where I was last week, talking to the West Sussex growers near Chichester, they want much more planning for glass houses. They don't have a target for food in there, so it's not getting factored in. We need to have bigger buildings. We need to have higher welfare buildings that have more space, more air, poultry sheds, dairies. We need to have slurry storage, cover. Planning, a nightmare. So that has to be the first point that gets over the line. And what I said to Steve Barclay yesterday, we need a food security summit, as he committed to, every single year. And him or whoever as Prime Minister. So these are the same asks for the Conservatives as they are for Labour or anybody else. But until we achieve that, nothing but nothing else will happen. So what does, I guess, good look like? And to finish on, you know, we have worked long and hard at the NFU across our commodities, across all land areas, on effectively trying to create a new economic model for how we deliver on natural capital. And the challenge in all of this is that there are no economic building blocks for natural capital that are established, that are recognised. So these markets have to be defined as to what they look like. And we have set out five core principles. They have to work alongside domestic food production, fibre and energy production as well. They have to complement public policy and government initiatives in ELMS. They have to allow farmers and buyers to participate with confidence in that defined market. They have to be accessible across a range of farm sizes and land tenures and different business structures. And they have to fairly reward farmers for the delivery of public goods. And I would highlight two things here. The role of cluster farms, which I'm a passionate believer in for what they have achieved. And I'm lucky enough to be, in my part of the world, part of a whole catchment collaboration with the Environmental Farmers Group that has brought all of those clusters together to create a new cooperative, to create a new trading platform whereby we all, myself as a tenant, landowners, tenants, all invest in that platform, and we are establishing new trades in water quality, biodiversity, net gain. We are working with the Game and Wildlife Conservancy Trust as the technical expertise, because the fundamental point with this is it must be farmer-owned and farmer-led, but backed by the technical capability of whoever that might be to be able to record what is being done, to be able to measure, to be able to deliver, but ultimately to be able to establish these new trades. So you can see a world out there, and I personally, and there's a danger of me becoming too demob happy in my last 4 months, I would like to see a policy now. We are on a delinking road. We should be linking to sustainability. I think the delinking road is a very dangerous one. We have legislation through the Environment Act and the Environment Improvement Plan that Michael Gove, when he set it out in the beginning, said we've got to have a minimum of 70% of farmland actively engaged. So I would like to see an opt-out and that budget linked to sustainability outcomes. There is a cost to decarbonisation. We cannot hope that productivity alone is going to deal with this. There is a cost and there is a value to decarbonisation, and we really have to look at a budget that is effectively ring-fenced for those sustainability requirements. And bearing in mind what I said about risk and volatility, we've got to make sure that there is something in place, and I would like to see a standardised approach, certainly with England, Scotland and Wales, whereby we are allowing that baseline to operate. You could do it as an opt-out, so you don't have to be part of it, but you're on there measuring the baseline. You know, if we look at water quality, we've got to have buffer strips, but they've got to be paid for on every single watercourse. We've got to do this at scale, and we've got to do it quickly. And at the moment, we've got 4,600 farmers who are actively applying, doesn't mean to say they are anywhere near through, actively applying in England to be part of the SFI. And we are at the end of this Parliament, So there is not time to hang around, and we need to be, I believe, passionately able to twist in all of this and get it right. So the future, I think, if we can get everybody on that farm tier foundation, if we can then allow a new economic model to allow farmers to establish these trades in natural capital, then I think it starts to look great. And, you know, potentially one of the criteria of being on that platform is assurance. We're already doing it, whether you're organic, whether you're leaf, whether you're red tractor, greener tractor, someone's got to pay for it. At the moment, retail has got the ensuite bathroom, it's got rid of the plastic bath, now it wants the gold taps, and someone has got to pay for it. So if the market's not going to pay for it, then we have to look at public money paying for it. So it makes complete sense to me that we join all of this up, what the market wants, what Brand Britain is going to stand for, and make sure that we finally do deliver on earned recognition. I hate to think whether I've gone over time or not. I can't feel the steely eyes of Charlotte staring into me, but I will pause.
Before I start rugby tackling.
Okay, thank goodness for that. I will pause there. Thank you.
I'm so glad I didn't have to rugby tackle you. It would have been inelegant, wouldn't it? I'm sure that will have inspired questions and comments, ladies and gentlemen, so get yourself onto the Slido now. In the meantime, let's hear from Adam White. He's Head of Agriculture at Barclays Bank, and we'll have a look at the economic outlook for us all. Thanks, Adam.
Good morning. It's always difficult to follow Minette, who, if anybody was at the Farmers Weekly Awards, made a room of 400 farmers cry. There was some drink flowing around, but it's the first time I've seen a room that large cry, so hopefully I can live up to it. But The first question I always get asked as a banker at any of these events or when I meet customers is, what's going to happen with interest rates? So I thought, I'll do my research, I'll speak to our chief economist, I'll say, what do I say? And he said to me, I quote, Adam, only a fool tries to forecast interest rates. I thought I'm going to have a go, and then this morning it was announced that inflation is reduced to 4.6%, which has completely thrown out everything that I'm about to say to you. So it may be useful, but it will give you a view on where I think things are going and where markets suggest things are going. So there's obviously been 2 consecutive Monetary Policy Committee meetings now where rates have been held, and that's been a good sign, primarily as inflation has started to fall. However, fixed rates, if you speak to your bankers, if you look at markets, fixed rates are a fantastic indicator of where potentially interest rates are going. If you look at a 5-year fixed rate at the moment, it's 4.61%, and a 10-year is 4.44. So if we look at that curve, markets suggest that we start to see a reduction in late 2024 to early 2025. Now, obviously, with inflation changing today, that may well be different, but that gives us a good indication of where we were yesterday evening. I will stress, however, that it is highly unlikely, unless something should change, and that's not something that we should discount, given the global events we've seen over the last 5 years, that we see a return to pre-pandemic rates of 0.5%. Businesses and farms, in my opinion, should be planning for rates to settle around the 3.5–4.5% range, and investment decisions made with that in mind. There is obviously concern amongst our farmers about the impact of rising interest rates on their existing borrowing, and those are conversations that we're having regularly. However, our data doesn't suggest there are stresses, and from a banking perspective, stresses, we're talking about business failures, talking about failure to make payments. We're not seeing that, but we're obviously seeing concern. I think one of the things that banks have done very well over the last 10 years is really stress borrowing. So farmers may have borrowed at 0.5% base rate, but we will have stressed that at much, much higher rates to make sure that it's affordable and that farmers can continue to pay that. And I think that when we see rates start to reduce, that will have an impact. However, at the moment, that is impacting investment decisions from being made as farmers are concerned. Certainly when I talk to them about where rates are headed, are they continuing to rise? And I think up till probably around summer this year, we saw a huge drop in investment decisions, planning, things put on hold that potentially were going to go ahead because of uncertainty about rates. The AIC Power and Productivity Report that's been referenced this morning references the disparity in farm business income between large and small farms, and that's a common theme throughout my talk today. Hopefully this doesn't disappoint you, but I don't plan to go through economic data today. It's only a small part of the picture. It very often lags. It's messy. And as I found out this morning, things change very quickly that have a knock-on impact to economic data. So I'm not going to share a view with you of what agricultural markets' predicted incomes are. I think the FBI forecast from DEFRA is a perfect example where if you look at the current website, it says that dairy farm income will increase by 78% this year, which is highly unlikely given the changes in prices. Industry sentiment and context, particularly in the current environment, is a much better indicator, in my opinion, for direction and health of the agricultural sector. Gives us an opportunity to look ahead at what the future operating environment could look like and then take strategic decisions based on that outlook. So I'm going to start with some context, and the great thing about my role is I get to talk to lots and lots of different people across the supply chain. I'm going to focus on the farm to retail the supply chain and try to give you some thoughts about where those sectors are thinking, where their plans are. So FMCG companies, particularly boards and investors, are seeing emissions reduction, regenerative farming, nature-friendly food as a large part of their commitments to ESG aims. One of the things that I am constantly challenged by is assessing the economic value of those aims. The fact that they're happening suggests that they are vitally important to boards, to companies, to investors who take a long-term view on where consumers and governments are trending. But when faced with such a huge challenge that potentially doesn't have direct economic consequences, decisions are made for the long term, sometimes ignoring those economic norms. The example I'd give is if you're the Chief Sustainability Officer of Apple, you have a target that your board has set for reducing emissions. The decisions you need to make, the investments you need to make, the costs that you need to incur to deliver that are not necessarily economic. they're going to be necessary to achieve those targets, which are very hard to link back to economic outcomes. For example, if any of you have seen the Apple new phone cases, they've got rid of leather, they've replaced their plastic. There's additional costs involved with doing that. There's additional impacts, but they haven't been taken with costs and economic situations in mind. And I think that's why we've all heard examples of farmland being sold well above market prices across the UK, very often to investment companies, and I'm sure we've all heard that story of an investment company purchasing land at very high levels, because those decisions are being made on a first mover advantage. They're not necessarily being made from an economic perspective of what the long-term value of that output of that land is. And in this case, that could be a contributor to driving the increasing value of farmland across the UK, which is a good thing, but we need to think about the long-term situation. However, what we should not think, and certainly farmers and people in this room, is that sustainability and net zero is the only driving factor for the FMCG sector. Research recently from BDO shows that top of the agenda for the supply chain is probably things that are on the mind of people in this room: recruitment, implementing technology, defending against cyber attacks, and adjusting to consumer preferences. All of these are long-term issues, and the industry recognises that experimentation is key to dealing with these challenges. Many of my team always say to me, Adam, when are we going to stop changing? When are we going to have 6 months where we can just get on and do the things that we've said we're going to do? That world doesn't exist anymore. We left that in 2018. And I think all through the supply chain, we're seeing this move towards experimentation and development of risk sharing. Now, there is a significant role for farmland to play in achieving the overall UK net zero ambitions. The Climate Change Committee has highlighted that in their reports, and the farmers that I talk to see that as an opportunity for them to realise financial benefits. I see that, I speak to many farmers who see that as vital now to their farm's economic sustainability. However, Robert and I were talking yesterday and shared this, but the Financial Times recently published an article which showed that if you added up all of the commitments made across different sectors on woodland, bioenergy crops, peatland, homes, nature and food, the UK would need to create 30% additional farmland. We're not making any more, as the old saying goes. So the AIC's call for the creation of a land use strategy is hugely welcome and vital to providing certainty to farmers and the supply chain that supports farmers on how their land could be used and provide economic certainty for those schemes and programmes that farmers may choose to place hopefully unproductive land into. Land use is only one part of the emerging challenge. Practical support and advice is also important. There are some excellent examples of supply chain working together across the industry. An example of this, and I've personally experienced this, is the dairy sector, where Arla, First Milk, and apologies if I've missed any others, they provide hands-on support by professional advisors to identify areas where the farm can be more sustainable, reduce emissions, helping that farmer to understand what could be a fairly complicated carbon audit, which doesn't make a lot of sense when you just look at the numbers, rewarding that activity financially and providing confidence to both the farmer and the bank that future investment on farm will have a positive impact on emissions, costs and income. My final point on context would be the training, skills and advice required to achieve practical improvements on farm or consideration of how land is used by a farmer. The advice provided by Arla and First Milk is practically useful, and I fully agree with the AIC's call to develop training and education programmes. There does, however, need to be farmer involvement in future technological innovation. Through our Barclays Eagle Labs partnership with the University of Lincoln, we have adapted our approach now to create a bridge between farmers and entrepreneurs to enable them to identify and solve common problems. Too often, and I'm sure many of you have spoken to businesses that are at the early stage of development, have generated ideas or started to commercialise ideas that have no practical impact on farms in the UK or fail to solve even a real issue. Academia, farmers and entrepreneurs together can have a much bigger impact than anyone on their own, particularly in an economic environment where capital is much more expensive, and we won't return to the days of 2001 where money will be chasing entrepreneurs. They need to have real impact in society. So I've provided you some context, so let's get to the interesting stuff. Well, what are our farmers telling us? How do they feel? Where do they see the opportunities? The view across farming customers, in the same way as Robert's mentioned on the farm business income data, is polarised, with small farms tending to be more sceptical about net zero. We recently undertook a survey alongside structured interviews with a number of customers, and in total, 45% of farmers that we surveyed believed that net zero was an important part of decision-making on their farm. However, these farmers also told us the three biggest challenges facing their farm were remaining profitable, rising fuel prices, and rising energy prices. Somebody even quoted the phrase, and it might be one of yours, Minette, but you can't be green if you're in the red. And that came through on an email personally to me, so that was nice. For those farmers that do have a net zero plan and are taking action, and they tend to be larger farmers, farmers who borrow, farmers with larger incomes, there is a concern about emissions measurement, stating that 70% of those that had undertaken some form of carbon auditing were not confident in the results. This shows the very real concern among farmers about the variety of carbon measurement and verification tools and lack of certainty about their accuracy. Certainty in decision-making alongside the cost of delivering changes came across loud and clear in the research. And Minette's talked about this, Robert's talked about this, a number of us spoke about this at dinner yesterday, is that our farmers are telling us they're unsure of what to do. When you're in an environment where risks and interest rates are higher and risks have a real financial consequence, making a decision for the long term when it could be superseded by a change in approach, where farmer is left holding the risk, is unpalatable. It is, and I stress this, the sector is very polarised. There are a significant number of large and medium-sized farms who are taking a lead in areas such as regenerative farming, biodiversity improvement, at the same time improving the economic resilience of their farm. Showcasing and celebrating these farms is key to sharing best practice across the sector. One of the things that came out in our research was, I want the bank to help me, but I want other farmers, I want my neighbours to tell me what they're doing and how I can adapt that on my farm. We've recently launched an event called Farm to Farm, where we get a small number of farmers, around 20, on another farm, just to showcase some of that best practice and let people learn. Food security was on the radar for nearly every single one of the farmers we spoke to in structured interviews. The National Food Strategy report, published in 2021 now, showed an approach for three types of farms. Those that are excellent at producing food at a large scale, using technology to deliver productivity gains. Those smaller farms who will combine food production with natural capital market access to supplement their income. And finally, those farms and estates who focus purely on rewilding and nature. This is a really important point, as when I speak to farmers, sometimes the perception is that we're all expected to rewild, we're all expected to use natural capital. We will continue to have farms, possibly larger but medium-sized farms, who are fantastic at producing food. There's no suggestion that every piece of land in the UK will be rewilded. Each and every farm will continue to have a unique approach. So to summarise, how do I think all of this matters for AIC members? I focus primarily on FMCG companies who are driving what and how farmers are producing food. You may already see these demands coming through the supply chain, be it for animal feed with reduced soya, or reduced level of imported ingredients to meet dairy's commitments and recommendations, or reductions in fertiliser demand, or requirements for different types of fertiliser. The three-farm model I've just described shows that there will continue to be farms who focus purely on the production of food. Technology will be key to them in improving efficiencies. And as the AIC has published today, being at the forefront of technology, R&D, training and skills is key to AIC members. But as we are seeing through the supply chain, experimentation and agility are key as the world and sector we operate in changes at an ever-changing pace. The final message I would leave, and one that Barclays are working to solve, which is the emergence of new or expanded agricultural industries. We spend a lot of time talking about emissions or prevention, but very little time talking about adaptation. I was with a vineyard in Kent last week who were telling me of the massive focus from French producers on obtaining land in the UK, where by 2040 there could be an ability to grow more resistant varieties of grapes and rival French wine quality, which I think we already do. This is, of course, an extreme example, but the UKRI predicted in 2016 that temperatures were already having a limited but positive impact on pasture productivity, root crops, leafy vegetables, and some fruit crops. I've had discussions with customers further north who have seen demand from their products from suppliers in southern Europe who are struggling to grow crops they have traditionally. Being prepared to adapt to changing temperatures, consumer trends, and regulatory needs is the biggest challenge facing any business supporting the farming and food sector. Being agile, being experimental is key to staying ahead of these economic, social, and environmental changes. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam. Loads of questions coming in on Slido, so keep them coming. Now let's hear from I can never say this, Professor Sir Charles Godfrey from Oxford University. Charles.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. It's an enormous pleasure to be here, and it's an enormous privilege to be given an opportunity to, as an academic who talks a lot about farming and land use, to speak to people who actually do things on the farm. I should say it's also a lovely privilege to share a stage with Minette in the last couple of months of her presidency of the NFU. She's shown superb leadership, and in my world and university world, we really appreciate how you've reached out to us as well. So what I'm going to do in my 20 minutes is to do two things. First, I want to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities around land use, largely in this country. And then I want to argue what it might mean on the ground. And there's actually going to be quite a lot of common ground between what I'm going to talk about and what Minette and Adam have just talked about. Now, my sort of official title is a Professor of Population Biology, and I guess that's why I always start off with what I think is an extraordinarily good news, that the rate of growth of global populations is decelerating, and that almost certainly we will hit a population maximum this century or early next century, and we've probably already gone through peak children. Now, one of the reasons this is happening is people are becoming wealthier, coming out of poverty, which is a good thing, and so that means that they will demand better diets that take more resources to produce. And there are various estimates, but the estimates I trust suggest that by mid-century, second half of this century, the globe will need to produce somewhere in the order of 30 to 60% more food. And I think this then is a great challenge for us in the UK, for the farming industry in the UK. What should we do in the face of that increasing demand? The government's response to the Henry Dimbleby's food strategy report wasn't very great, but I think probably the most interesting thing that came out of it was a commitment to keep food production at current rates, something that Minette referred to. And you could argue it in different ways. You could argue that we live in one of the most biodiversity depauperate countries in the world. Perhaps we should de-intensify our agriculture. Perhaps we should have much more nature. Or you can argue it the other way, and this is the way that I would argue, that we are one of the most innovative agricultural industries in the world, and we should be stepping up to actually produce more food to meet the global challenge as we see ahead. And I'd like to argue that, and at a time when cakeism has rather gone out of fashion because of certain recent prime ministers, I would argue that there is a possibility to have your cake and eat it, to produce more food and to meet some of those multiple challenges that Adam mentioned. When you look at all the commitments that governments have made over the last decade, one would need more land than exists to meet them unless one makes some radical changes. So just on the technology opportunities and challenges, we've heard quite a bit about this already. I'm very much looking forward to looking at the AIC report in details. There is such an opportunity here. And this goes back to something Minette, I think, said very eloquently. We need to convince governments, we need to convince our scientific establishment that there is more to life sciences research than biomedical. We could do a huge more in this area, and I think we have to look, are we making the most of our agricultural research ecosystem? Are we getting the flow of ideas from fundamental science all the way through to farm right? And I know there are many people in the audience who are concerned and have contributed to that. Looking ahead, we've heard a lot about climate change, and this is going to become increasingly to the fore, and it is going to be increasingly apparent when it comes to both land use and farming policy. Something that I find rather scary, working in a university where we have a lot of atmospheric physicists who are involved in the fundamental modeling of a changing climate, and they are surprised by how fast the climate is changing. And we've seen globally and both in this country some of the extreme events of the last couple of years. I always thought that climate change would really become apparent in our children's generation. It's becoming apparent in our generation at the moment. That means that when one looks at land use, there's going to be increasing attention, land use and agriculture, on peatlands, a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, on the complex issues around livestock and methane. So these direct effects of land use and emissions will become more policy prominent. The direct effects of climate change on farming production, as we've heard from Minette as well, will become increasingly prominent. And then there will be more indirect effects, and I'm going to highlight two here. So many companies in retail and food services are making net zero commitments and are boiling down to try and see how they can actually make them. In the jargon, they're looking at their Scope 3 emissions. And when they look at it, they see a lot of the emissions are due to livestock-associated foods. And so we are going to see changes, like it or not, in the demand for meat and dairy. And some of the alternative proteins that you'll all know about and are coming to the fore, whether we like it or not, they are going to affect our livestock industry. And I think that the key to that is to get on the front foot and to try and anticipate both the direct effects and demands and the complex effects that it will make, what you can do with different cuts of meat. In a time where, in a decade, we may see a very large proportion of, for example, meat that goes into processed products, patties, sausages, actually coming from alternative sources. And so that's a negative, a potentially negative effect on at least parts of the industry. I think the other thing that we're going to see is increasing concentration on carbon removal in farmland. And I'm not going to go through all the different technologies here. You'll know many of them: perennial biomass crops, planting trees, technologies that exist at the moment, to things like enhanced rock weathering. That machine there is spreading powdered basalt onto the farmland. These are really exciting opportunities that may bring in novel income streams to farmers. It's a curious thing that the basic research is still having to be done at a time when there are companies out there that are beginning to market carbon credits. And it is a bit of the Wild West out there. And were I to have a single ask to government right at the moment, is that they should intervene in this market to try and get some standards and certification in, because I really worry that what might be a very valuable income flow to farmers may become just, there'll be sufficient lack of confidence in this market that it won't happen. There is increasing realization from the general public about the importance of biodiversity, and this is going to affect land use policy and land use decisions. And of course, there are two aspects of biodiversity. There is the instrumental aspect, the fact that natural capital in its broadest sense, including biodiversity, actually provides a good service for farmers. And I like Dieter Helm's, a colleague of mine at Oxford, his sort of narrative around natural capital, which is not to try and value natural capital, but to value the importance of the maintenance of natural capital, that we should see natural capital as an infrastructure that we need to support from current payments as well as investing in the future. But in thinking of the instrumental importance of natural capital and of biodiversity, I think we must also look at the importance of biodiversity and the duty of stewardship. And this is something that many farmers are already aware of. On the right there is a corn bunting. It doesn't come from Helen Browning's farm, but Helen's shown me around her farm. I have never seen more corn buntings than I have on Helen's farm. There is really important on-farm diversity. And there is also off-farm diversity as well. And I know that in the industry there is a lot of suspicion about rewilding, but a small limited amount of rewilding is going to be absolutely essential for maintaining some of the non-farm biodiversity. And that slide to the bottom left actually is from NEP. And there is a little bit of farming going on there, but that is land largely managed for for biodiversity. And then we've heard about the geopolitical challenges at the moment, the shocks of pandemic, the Ukraine, what might happen in the future. And this has raised rightly the profile of food security. I've been arguing for over 10 years that we should be stress testing the global commodity markets, the global food system, in the way that we rather wish we had been stress testing the banks in the early 2000s. And recently, a friend of mine from Cargill pointed out, well, haven't we been stress tested over the pandemic and over Ukraine, over the blockage in the Suez Canal? And I have to say that if I had been asked in February or March 2000 how the global food system would have come through these challenges, I would not have been as sanguine as it has turned out. So I think that there is some good news there, that there is robustness and resilience in the food system, but huge danger of being complacent. I think we should still be doing that type of stress testing, but I do think there is some good news there. And then, of course, we have the particular context of the UK. We've gone through Brexit. We have the opportunity to have a bespoke means of putting money into our rural economy, unlike the CAP, which has to work from the Peloponnese to Finland. We have the roughly £3 billion a year. And the point that Minette made is that this is ring-fenced for a certain period of time, but not in perpetuity. And its value in real terms is falling because of inflation. And I think there's a really strong argument to be made about maintaining that. And then, of course, there are issues around levelling up and the fact that many farmers, we just heard this from Adam, their businesses are really at the boundaries of being sustainable or not. And I think that figure is a little bit out of date, but 42% of farms would be insolvent without the single farm payment. So just a little bit of an advert here. I was involved with a report from the Royal Society on issues around multifunctional landscapes. The Royal Society, our National Academy, what are we doing opining in this area? Well, what we try to do is to look at some of both the natural science and the social science that feeds into this area. And we reaffirmed the logic behind public money for public good, which of course begs the question of exactly what is a public good, and I'll mention something about that at the moment. But we also tried to argue that a good way of thinking about land use going ahead is that all land must be productive. But I put productive in inverted commas there because one has to think of production in a broader than traditional way. So it's absolutely critical important that we should increase traditional productivity, the provision of private goods. But we also need to look at the production of public goods, carbon sequestration, homes for biodiversity, and thinking of these as multiple components of production and looking at the comparative advantage of different lands for producing different goods, both private and public, we argue is a good way about thinking of the future. And then with contributions from our colleagues at the British Academy, the social science, we talked about narratives around farming and the changing role of farming, and that looking at the challenges ahead. I mentioned earlier that some of the challenges for the livestock industry, the critical importance of having just transitions and of having a narrative of taking multiple groups, stakeholders and interest groups with us together. And then just a very brief word on some of the issues around public good. So public goods has a really technical definition within economics. And actually, that is what I think is worthwhile taking. There was Neil Parish, when he was chairing the Agricultural Select Committee, asked Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, does my right honourable friend agree that supporting food production in the country is a public good? And that's confusing the technical public good from something that is good for the public. And I have to say that May very astutely made that distinction. So I think we have to be careful about what we talk about with food security. Again, as both Minette and Adam says, food security is not self-sufficiency. We need to look for the market failures there, which might be in insurance, as Minette said, but might be in other areas. And then there are more complex issues, what economists call merit goods. If we want higher standards of animal welfare than the market will bear, then that is not technically a public good, and some economists would say that should not be in the mantra of public money for public good. But I think if we as a society demand higher welfare standards from our farming community, then that certainly falls within the category. So very briefly, I want to talk about how I see things might go further on. And I said that there was an overlap with the previous speaker, and Adam talked about how one might think about a three-compartment view of agriculture going ahead. And the first thing I want to say is that if one looks at the diversity of farming and the comparative advantage of different farms for producing private and public goods, it very much is a continuum. But nevertheless, I think it is helpful to think in terms of three different categories. And the way I think about it is land chiefly managed for food production, land managed for multiple outputs, and land that is taken out of agriculture and used for non-food outputs. And I'd argue, and we review it in the Royal Society report, that there's a growing evidence base for that. There's great work that's come out of University of Cambridge on this, and Henry Dimbleby in the Food Strategy also support this. And I should also say that the Green Alliance, led by Dustin Benton, to me has done some of the most insightful analysis, both at the biophysical level, but also at the economic level as well. And so just briefly, so land chiefly managed for food production, it needs to be genuinely sustainable. I mean, I think everyone agrees with that now. Sustainability is interesting. We talk a lot about sustainability, but if we don't farm sustainability, either we've got the definition wrong, or at some stage we will hit the buffers. And it might be sooner than we think that lack of sustainability really comes home to work. So I've already talked about the opportunities in this country with our science base, with our very sophisticated agricultural system, for really knowledge intensive, using all the benefits of technology, but also ecological insights as well. There will be some opportunities for example, biodiversity on intensively used farmlands, no regret opportunities, how you manage your land in winter for birds and things. And this is the area where there will be limited or no public goods payment going in. And one could argue just how much that occurs. And then we have land chiefly managed for multiple outputs, where we take some reduction in yields as a trade-off to allow other things, maybe biodiversity, maybe carbon sequestration. And we need to be honest that these trade-offs exist. I sometimes worry that some good people within the environmental movement do not acknowledge that one cannot have everything. That if one wants to get, for example, rich biodiversity on farmland, there is very likely to be an effect on yields. Highly knowledge intensive, both technology, agroecology, as I said, farmland biodiversity, and the production of public goods attracting an income stream. And then finally, land chiefly managed for non-food outputs. I think there are real importance about carbon sequestration in woodlands. We have to do something about peatlands. Emissions from peatlands is a really major part of our carbon budget. More straightforward in the uplands, hugely complex in the lowlands where the soils are so good for farming. I think that there is a role for some rewilding, but I really would encourage people not to be frightened about rewilding. We're talking about a relatively small fraction. Again, this is all really highly knowledge intensive, and there will be some private private goods produced here, and novel financial instruments need to be developed to get money flowing into this. But this is also an area where public money for public good works. So how do we get there? Well, it requires culture change. It requires everyone interested in this to realise that we can't have it all. We have to make compromises. I think the land use framework, we're yet to see how that will work out, but we do need a land use framework. It's very interesting, the Food Security Committee that AIC is arguing for. I think that's a great idea. I think the one thing I'd ask is, does it need to look beyond food security to think about food security and environment security and land use in general? But whatever the details are, we definitely need something like that. We need elms to evolve. We need political bravery and leadership. So just to conclude, UK farming and land use, I believe, face unprecedented challenges at the moment. Again, repeating what the two previous speakers have said. And maintaining the status quo is not an option. We won't get any of the things that we want from net zero to food security with the status quo. And I believe that there is a real opportunity to find common ground between the industry, between the environmental groups, and to have a land use policy for the UK that will allow us, passé Boris Johnson, to have our cake and eat it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. An awful lot of questions, so forgive me, I am going to rattle through them. Brief and to the point answers, and all the questions are exactly that. Okay, let's start with the most popular on Slido. Does the lack of UK food production targets give evidence that the UK government is exporting sustainability issues around food production in the UK? A UK garden state, asks Anonymous. Do you want to start, Minette?
Well, yes, it does, because you know, we have had those different approaches. Boris Johnson's government wanted food production, couldn't have mattered less back in the day. But on the back of COVID and a war in Ukraine, this government has said it does, but they've now got to walk the talk. So they've got to do something about it. We've got a food strategy that's been ditched, sitting on a shelf. They've got to start putting this in place, and the annual reporting, a statutory requirement, would be a start to that. So.
Yeah, just completely agree, and especially on carbon, the tools are out there. We can begin to measure it. Harder for other things, but we just need to do it.
Yeah. I think just the lack of having it talked about means that farmers assume that it's not important. I don't think that's the intention, well, I hope that's not the intention, but not having that joined-up approach, I think, doesn't help.
Okay. Aled Jones says, we've come out of a common agricultural policy to an uncommon policy. How are we to achieve a unified approach on food security and climate policies?
I think it's really essential. You know, we are in danger of having more commonality between the EU 28 than within the UK 4. So we've got to have a standardised approach. I think it does start with that budget that is linked to sustainability. And I think it's perfectly within the art of the doable, but it's got to be done nation by nation. But if there is no budget there, and I think this is the devolves nervousness now, that actually with England on this journey, 50% cap monies, 733 million that is, for this year, we have got to have a common approach, because at the moment, English farmers, we're the only country in the G20 that is stepping back from food production. Scotland hasn't started, Wales hasn't started. So for the next Parliament, we have got to have, I think, a standardised approach to food production, and then allow the drawdown options, whatever they might be, for the environment that will differ wherever you are in this country and in the devolved countries.
Anyone else?
I agree. Yeah. I completely agree.
George Eustace, in his after-dinner speech last night, talked about trying to take some things out of the political bear pit and having a consensus. Now, cynically, you might say, well, facing what might be the next election, then he might say it right at this moment. But I think that is an important suggestion. And there may be a window of opportunity, were there to be a change of government, or even actually if the Conservatives remain in power, to actually do that.
David Fawkes asks, in the EU, up to 70% of farmers are members of a cooperative. Why are only 16% of UK farmers members of co-op? What's the NFU doing to promote collaboration?
Well, I couldn't agree more with David. I don't know whether there's something about living on an island that affects your mentality. You'd think your mentality would be to collaborate more, but it's not always the case. Look, it's absolutely essential that outside of the EU that we buy more together, that we sell more together. It's a no-brainer. It's not easy, but it's something that I passionately believe in. It's why I reference the EFG. There's no reason why that, as a cooperative, can't extend further from environmental sales effectively into buying, into selling. It's got to happen.
What's really interesting is when you look at nature, carbon markets, and we are starting to see farmers collaborate in those areas, and we're seeing clusters arise, we're seeing those work together. There's always a concern about farmers falling out. We're really good at that in the UK. And where does it go from there? But I certainly think there's an opportunity to move that back towards food production.
Okay. David Bates, how do you see private capital investment being involved in the development of natural capital markets?
So I think there's an issue at the moment, if you speak to any of the farms that are producing capital, is around where does it come from? Because it's coming from marketing budgets at the moment, not from operational budgets. And we all know marketing budgets are very short term. So there is a concern around the long-term nature of where those funds are available from. I think one of the estates that I've spoken to has talked about that the capital should be there for the maintenance of biodiversity and nature, but there needs to be investment from farmers and from government to help the creation of those environments, and maintenance is where that capital comes in.
I mean, if I can make one specific point here. So I mentioned it in my talk, carbon removal on farmland, whether it's biochar, enhanced rock weathering, where there are products out in the market where you can buy carbon credits on that, but we still need the basic research. And in a country where we're so good at fintech, it should be possible to have a certifiable product that both contributes to the research, gives you some carbon credit, and I think there might be a role for government to underwrite some of the carbon credits if they don't occur, but it still produces intellectual property to help the markets going at pace.
I'm going to sort of mix two questions together here, but I think it will make sense. Anonymous again. Return on capital at farm level is less than 1%, with many farmers working below the living wage. Is this sustainable? If not, who's responsible for change? And allied to that, Minette, you spoke about how BPS has been the only way volatility has been tackled recently. How do you think it should be done going forward, bearing in mind the 1% point?
Yeah, and there's another question, I think, coming up on insurance. To date, government has shown no sign of wanting to go down the insurance route. I mean, it would need a substantive pot of money to do it, and there is no appetite, seemingly. And if you look at the national debt, it's probably impossible to do now anyway. So that is why a land-based payment has been important. The other thing is it's easy to deliver, and we know that it is deliverable. The point, though, on the 1%, look, this is a critical point right now for those that are closest to the market, whether that's eggs, poultry, meat, pigs, growers. And I believe unless at corporate and social responsibility level, retailers, shareholders, boards take the ownership of their relationship with their supplier, nothing is going to change. It is cultural change at the top of those businesses. They know that the road that they are on is unsustainable. And, you know, they have got to have it as a badge of honour that their producers say that they have a great relationship. You know, that's got to happen, and it needs to be competitive. Imagine if Tesco's could come out and say that. It would be transformative. At the moment, the buyer gets the badge of honour. The more ruthless, the tougher negotiator they are, that's where it sits. So it doesn't work with those that are closest to the marketplace. And then with broadacre farming, you've got to have something, because we've got all this legislation. There's a lot of cost to that. And so there has got to be something there. So I don't think we should rule out not a return to BPS, absolutely not, but a land-based payment that does deal with volatility, trade deals, all of those things that are coming in. And I think we should be looking GB UK-wide on that. Charles?
And risk needs to be shared further up the food chain than it is at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, one quick one probably to end. Natural capital. How important is it to establish a verifiable baseline for each farm business? And if yes, who pays for that? Charles?
It is important. I think that is a public good. I am optimistic about technological breakthroughs and that. Full disclosure, I'm on the board of the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, who's doing wonderful work about trying to look at natural capital baselands using remote sensing. And it, again, like carbon sequestration on grassland, this is something where we're sort of building an aircraft in mid-air. So we need to do both the research and deployment simultaneously. We don't have the luxury to do them sequentially.
The only thing I'd add is, and I'm very nervous about the weight we place on biodiversity net gain, because I've spoken to a number of the large house builders, and in their minds, they're hoping to make about 70% of the gains that they need to on site, because otherwise it's a cost that goes on to building houses. So I think I don't think the opportunity is going to be as large as we think it is, and I think that's where having that proper science-led approach means that we do it properly.
I mean, biodiversity net gain is pretty broken at the moment.
Yeah.
Look, I think measuring the baseline effectively, and not just on biodiversity, but on carbon as well, is really important. We have some of the best scientific research stations in the world, in this country. If you look at the work Rothamsted have done, it underpins maize crop insurance in the US, and we're not bringing them together enough. So one of our asks of the election is that we do bring a scientific advisory group effectively together to look at, what we should be measuring on the baseline and what tool we should use. That will pick a fight in an empty room. But if we could just coalesce around one or two tools, then at least, it would. I can see some people, Phil Bittnell included, shaking his head. But we can't continue with 62 different ones, and what probably in 2 years' time will be 162 different ones. So we've got to take some leadership here. In measurement, because I think it's really important.
Okay, let's take a quick Slido poll before we break for coffee. Does the industry believe that the economic outlook for agriculture over the next 18 months is positive? Vote now on your phones / laptops. If you were voting, how would you not be voting, Charles? The economic outlook positive for agriculture over the next 18 months.
I think the banker should go first.
Oh gosh, I was hoping the academic was. This is where we need to work together, isn't it? So I'm an eternal optimist. I'm quite neutral. I think there are things that could happen that we don't know about, but I think I'm certainly speaking to farmers who I walk away with a buzz and are doing interesting things. But I think that polarisation is so important to understand.
Yeah. Charles?
Well, I would have voted mildly disagree, but with low expertise.
Minette?
All our surveying that we do, our farmer confidence survey, for the first time, we've not seen it like this before, both short and mid-term confidence is really low. And that is primarily driven by the lack of certainty. If there were certainty, farmers would feel far more confident. They don't have the certainty, and that's what's driving both short and mid-term.
Yeah.
And indeed is why we end up, I guess, with that mildly disagree at 36%.
Yeah.
Strongly, there are 4% of optimists in this room, which is always nice to know. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go to a coffee break. We're running a little bit late, but only a little bit. So please be back here at 12:05. Thank you very much. Thank you.